Why India's largest airline collapsed in 4 days.
Bharat's largest airline with more than 60% of the market share, IndiGo, is in turmoil, stranding tens and thousands of passengers, more than 1,000 flights cancelled.
Viewers, as IndiGo meltdown continued, visuals of passenger fury emerged from across the world.
What are the real reasons behind it? And how DGCA norms are associated with it? And what has changed since then? The failure of India's biggest airline, IndiGo, was not merely an operational glitch. It has highlighted far more weaknesses, not just in the aviation market, but also in the governance. Hello everyone, welcome to Vajiram and Ravi's Flash News. My name is Shubhangi Singh, and today we are going to discuss not just this crisis situation that we have seen in the aviation sector in last 4 days, but also get into the governance aspect of it, what went wrong and what could have been done better in terms of the governance as well as the market. So starting with understanding that what has exactly unfolded in last 4 days. When we talk about what exactly happened, in last 4 days, we saw more than 2,000 flights either being cancelled or delayed, and this all started when the Directorate General of Civil Aviation brought the phase 2 of FDTL norms. So when we talk about FDTL norms, they are associated with flight duty time limitation, and this was not a random thought that was brought in by DGCA. I'll be discussing this in detail, we'll be breaking this down, not to worry. But as of now, what we saw, IndiGo, which is India's largest airline, which has a market share of up to 40%, saw a huge disruption and it impacted the market. And this is where we get to see a case study that how regulatory governance can disrupt the market and how it is different from market realities and how there needs to be a proper approach to bring in regulatory governance as well. So before we get into this whole case study and discussions around it, first let us move to the event that triggered this chaos. So if we talk about the event, as I mentioned, it was DGCA's phase 2 of FDTL norms. If we talk about phase 1 itself, it was brought back in last year, phase 1, that was July 2024. And it's not that this came out of blue. When we talk about all these companies, aviation companies, they had been given enough time as per DGCA when the phase 2 was announced, and it was supposedly to be effective from 1st November 2025. The whole idea was to make sure that there is improved pilot alertness and also safety in terms of managing fatigue. And that is why the phase 2 included certain provisions such as 48 hours minimum rest per week, which was initially only 36 hours. There was an expanded window for night duty. For example, any duty from 12 in the night to 6:50 in the morning, that was earlier narrow. This window of night duty has been increased now, and a new limit of maximum 2 night landings per week was fixed for pilots, which was earlier 6 weeks. But this is not the place where the problem started. This was just the initial point where FDTL brought in the phase 2. There were other changes as well, where there was mandatory rest after early consecutive flights, stricter monitoring in terms of circadian rhythm disruption, and enhanced documentation as well as digital fatigue reporting. And this is something very important if we understand the important role of pilot and his fatigue and his rhythm and his alertness playing in the safety of passengers. So the whole idea of this norms was just to make sure that there are better practices to ensure reduce fatigue related errors and also bring India's norm in place with the global best practices that we get to see. Now as a consequence, what happened, especially with IndiGo, which depends heavily on red-eye flights, that means late night and early morning flights, and they have the leanest manpower, especially pilot to aircraft ratio as compared to the global civil aviation companies that we get to see, and that is why IndiGo offers the low cost that we get to see. Because of these very reasons, the whole pilot roster collapsed because of heavy hub operations. They had weather issues, there was excessive congestion, and that is what led into a chain reaction where we saw the entire roasting grid being collapsed. The pilots who could operate earlier, they were not non-compliant because of the changes which were made by DGCA. The flights were cancelled in clusters, there was airport congestion, the weather also worsened, the crew displacement, and this went on for 4 to 5 days. Now, this was a whole series of events that has happened. Now, this will give you the base to understand what we are talking in terms of governance, regulatory governance, and as well as market structure. So, we will be starting with understanding that what impact it had. It had impact on passengers who missed their flight, who were stranded, who had to suffer, they did not have communication, the airfares surged like anything. It had impact on airline workforce who had absolutely no clue, pilots became overburdened, the crew was stuck with extra duty. IndiGo, which is the biggest player in aviation sector, their reputation got damaged, revenue loss, and they also came under the government monitoring radar. Furthermore, coming to the major impact that we need to understand, especially in terms of aviation and governance, is the fact that in this situation where there was an extreme point, the other airlines struggled to absorb whatever happened. Airport congestion could not manage in a difficult time, and sector-wide reliability perception that could be managed was weakened. Another thing that came on the end of government as well as regulator, because they brought in the norms without doing a proper mapping of what could happen, what does the sector look like, then they had to change and bring in flexibility. So, this looks like that there is no timing, and whatever their timing they had for reforms was flawed. Other than that, there was a pressure to balance safety with economic continuity which was directly hampered. So, this was not just an operational glitch or a one-time event. It is a multi-stakeholder shock which is affecting multiple stakeholders, the economy, the market, and also the regulator. In this very scenario, now let us try to understand that what is the regulation versus market reality. Because in this situation, when we talk about DGCA, the reform intent was very much right and it was strong. But we have to understand that it is also important to understand the system capacity. So, when we are talking about DGCA safety reforms, they were well in place, but the airlines could not implement them because they did not have pilot reserves. There was no transition planning, which was pretty much the company's fault because they had enough time, but it is also the fault on DGCA's end because a proper mapping of this issue and a proper transition plan should have been in place. Because if we talk about DGCA had been requested multiple times by IndiGo already because they are not in place to implement these rules. Another factor that we need to consider in this situation is that market and it was working on an over optimization model, especially the biggest player in this particular market, that is IndiGo. The business efficiency for IndiGo relied on high aircraft utilization, tight scheduling which DGCA norms changed, minimal idle crew, concentrated night waves of departure, and anything that changes this would absolutely destabilize IndiGo, which we just saw there. So, understanding of how market is functioning at the reality and how gradually this should be changed instead of disrupting the market is also an important factor. Other thing that came in front was the fact that there are structural weaknesses. As I highlighted, that the other players in the market were not able to absorb this situation because the situation that we are talking about, we get to see everywhere. India already faces pilot shortage. If we talk about 2025 gap, it is almost more than 1500 pilots. Other than that, captain shortage is also acute. Then we get to see the training pipeline. That means the thing that can fill up this gap is absolutely slow, and the admission or the type rating into this is also expensive. Furthermore, airlines use this as an advantage. Even though they compensate, they rely on overtime, not redundancy in this scenario. So, what we got to see, that a market which is systematically weak, it is extremely fragile, which works on extreme over efficient model, was all of a sudden bombarded with reforms. So both of the sides had to be better calibrated before this bombarding or the reform came in, or in this scenario it could have been a gradual thing was done, which is why in many ways it is also being called a governance failure, and there are many indicators showing that. For example, there is no presence of regulatory impact assessment. That means DGCA did bring in multiple reforms, but it did not have any traffic season assessment. There were no understanding of pilot availability modeling, airline wise readiness audit, how ready they are about it. That means if DGCA did not bother to understand this, then this was a predictable disaster or predictable chaos that happened. Other than that, there is no simulation of night duty demand that was understood by DGCA. This basically violates the basic public policy standards which are associated with anticipatory governance. If you want to bring a change, you need to understand what is going at the real ground level. Otherwise, you are making policy somewhere here, the ground situation is different. Even if it reaches there, it might do more harm than good, which we just saw in this situation. Another indicator that came in front of us was the idea of one size fit all. So when this policy came in, FDTL phase 2 norms came in, the idea was to bring relief, yes, but the relief would be different for different operators here, and the same rule was applied to full service carriers or low cost carriers. The differentiation should have been in terms of the carrier type as well. Airlines with high and low night operations, same rules. Airlines with different pilot ratio, same rules. No categorization, no customization at all. That means this is another example where rigid and no foresight governance can be understood. And furthermore, this situation also highlights key institutional communication gaps, where airlines are saying that we told DGCA we cannot do this, it is difficult. Pilot bodies are saying that airlines underreported fatigue and now it is out there. And DGCA, with the intent of reforms, did not address this situation. So it shows that all the stakeholders, regulator, the workforce and the industry, there was no communication or lack of communication in between, which resulted in a multi-stakeholder shock which impacted the regulator's intent. They had to bring in flexible changes that impacted the industry's reputation, and it also affected the workforce as well as the public. Now on this note, I will be discussing that what has been done to address this situation as of now. So there has been a temporary relief that has been brought in through temporary extension. DGCA has relaxed phase 2 norms for IndiGo specifically, but only until next 3 months. There are certain key concessions only for IndiGo: night duty allowance extension, extra roster facility, and temporary night landing has been increased, which was reduced in the phase 2 norms. Other than that, there has been certain measures that have been taken to safeguard and address the chaos. In this regard, passengers have to be addressed in a way that they have been given the option of food, flight, alternate flights, automatic refunds, rescheduling fees should be waived off, and assistance to families and elderly if it is required, so to address the chaos that is present at the airport. Other than that, on ground administrative measures have been taken. DGCA teams have been deployed at major airports. There is a proper communication from Ministry of Civil Aviation, a monitoring room has been created, and daily reporting mechanism has also been activated. So all this shows that the active crisis management and interagency coordination is at one place, but there is no denial that this was in a way a governance failure, a foresight failure, and also a market failure at the same time. Now on this note, I will be ending it. That was all from my side. Thank you so much.